Erik Erikson developed the psychosocial theory. The theory incorporates Sigmund Freud's theory of psychosexual development, but it emphasizes on the social issues instead of versus the sexual influence on development. This theory also looks at the person's progress through different stages. The stages develop the mental task of a healthy and normal activities to promote growth. The theory also includes if people are susceptible to learning age appropriate tasks, as well as if they can adapt and gain mastery in their own environment. Erik Erikson had 8 stages of psychosocial development. The 8 stages were stage 1, trust versus mistrust. And in this stage, this is where children learn how to trust others. This is where they can count on their caregivers to provide food, shelters, and love, as well as meeting their basic needs. If their needs are not met, this is where the infant starts learning mistrust towards others. The second stage is autonomy versus shame and doubt. And in this stage, this is where a child learns how to become independent and gain a sense of confidence. If they are pushed or if a parent oversteps, the child ends up acting on things that can develop the child to have self-doubt. The third stage is intuitive versus guilt. And in this stage, this is where a child learns and explores and starts beginning to manipulate their surrounding. This is where they begin to pursue their goals and interests in the future, whether it's becoming a doctor, nurse, playing careers. If the child is discouraged or lacks the confidence, this is where it is intuitive to shape their lives in a sense of self, or a sense of not knowing who they want to become. The fourth stage is industry versus inferiority. And this is where the child is productive and have a successful experience. This is where a child is learning how to be playful, and this is also giving them a chance to master their task or crafts. And in this stage, they also, if not successful, this is where repeated failures will develop from the feeling of the inferiority side. The fifth stage is identity versus identity confusion. In this stage, this is where adolescents begin to try out their roles of who they are in society, and how they can integrate their sense of self. If they're having issues or trouble in who they in their role in society or in their role in their environment, this is where they start experience confusion. And the sixth stage is intimacy versus isolation. This is where young adults begin looking for intimacy and closeness in their relationships, and their relationships can be whether it's in a physical relationship or their relationships within a family member. And if this is not properly integrated, the child or the youth can be at risk for isolation as they move on to their adulthood. The seventh stage is generativity and stagnation. And in this stage, this is where adults become invested in their work, their families, the communities, and future generations. If an adult has not successfully achieved this stage, they are unable to move past investing in themselves as well as are self-devoid. And they also become stagnant and unable to produce for the sake of others. And then the eighth stage is integrity versus despair. And during this stage, this is an old age. This is where an older adult starts or begins to reflect on their lives as well as their success of what they put into society, as well as if they're content with how their life was, and if they haven't been successful in this stage, they become not satisfied, and this is where the sense of despair comes, and they mourn the loss of the opportunity that they have that they haven't or weren't able to achieve. The strength and virtues for stage one is hope. And in stage one, hope is where where a child becomes successful in how they lead or how they progress in the rest of the stages. This is where they are hopeful to be a better, or it is hopeful for them to be a better person in society. If in stage two, if autonomy versus shame is successful, then the virtue that can lead for success is will. And if they are successful in the virtue of will, this is where children are encouraged and supported, and this increases their independence to want to increase their independence to be successful and have the ability to survive on their own. In stage three, the initiative versus guilt, the virtue is purpose, and this is the purpose of who they are, and if this virtue is not successful, then they end up having the sense of guilt. In stage four, industry versus inferiority, the virtue is competence. If they don't successfully meet competence, then they are most likely to develop some modesty. In stage five, identity versus role confusion, this is where virtue is fidelity, and this is when a person or the young adult is not involved or committed to oneself or accepting of others, and this can cause ideology differences. The sixth stage is intimacy versus isolation, and this virtue is love. And if they don't successfully achieve the virtue of love, then they begin to avoid intimacy, have fear of committing, as well as relationships can feel lonely or they can sometimes also end up in a depression. In generativity versus stagnation, the virtue is care, and during this stage is basically how the individual is connected into the community, or if they are uninvolved in the community and society. And the eighth stage is integrity versus disparity, and this stage is where the virtue is wisdom, and within this wisdom stage is how the elderly or close to the end of life, how a person views their life, whether it's what they gave back to the community, or if they felt whole. This is where the person may or may not feel as if they were complete. Regarding Erikson's possible incomes or outcomes of the stages, it is my belief that if a person doesn't successfully complete one, it will trickle down in what they do in all the other stages. For instance, if a young adult in stage 5, identity versus identity confusion, hasn't successfully achieved stage, I want to say intuitive, stage 2 in autonomy versus shame and doubt. This is where a child can, this is where stage 1, stage 2 and stage 5 can conflict due to the child not having the sense of confidence. And whereas in stage 5, the child or the young adult or the adolescent is trying to find themselves. So because they haven't successfully achieved stage 2, this is where they struggle in finding themselves and understanding themselves in stage 5. From a literature review, explore the child development of integrative psychotherapy, the first 3 stages, which is the trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame, and intuitive versus guilt. This literature review explores the child development in the first 3 stages. In another article, the development of a preschool social emotional inventory for preschoolers. This is looking at the understanding of preschool development, and preschool's development is between stage 2 and stage 3, autonomy versus shame and doubt, and stage 3, intuitive versus guilt, and looking at how their environment and how their sense of self is when they're around peers. The third scholarly article was read or reviewed was Ages in Stage, an exploration of the life cycle based on Erikson's 8 stages of development. And this is an article that is more in depth of the 8 stages and how it's developed, and how the 8 stages play a major role in our lifespan. And the last scholarly article is analyzing Erikson's stage 1 in adulthood. And this is the article is actually called Trust and Mistrust as Stress Reducing and Increasing Factors in Working Life. It analyzes Erikson stage 1 of adulthood. And in adulthood looks at work, families, community, and future generation. And when we're looking at trust, if we haven't successfully achieved trust in our stage 1, then we develop mistrust or trust issues when we meet other people, or we're not open or receptive to having someone new in our lives. And this is where we become stagnant, is to trust the process. If somebody becomes, goes to a new job, from a trust factor, I would assume if that person is comfortable in that setting, or if that person in their network of employment, do they trust the people that they work with to help them do the right, to develop as a team. So I believe that the trust and mistrust as stress reducing and increasing factor in working life in stage 1, this is important as adults begin to really try to continue finding themselves and their purpose in their families and work life and community, but also what their role looks like for the last stage. Some research questions that I thought of was, how can individuals overcome issues that may have arisen as a result of poorly resolved psychosocial crisis? The second question is, what may be expected if a psychosocial crisis is unresolved during this stage? And from my understanding, or from my perspective, individuals can overcome their psychosocial crisis by addressing where they weren't successful in the beginning. So if a person per se was able to successfully achieve stage 1, 2, and 3, and they haven't successfully completed 4, I believe that this is where they will lapse in the uncomfortability of themselves when trying to be intimate or be in an intimate relationship with anybody, or trying to be vulnerable and not being vulnerable. So a way to overcome this is by speaking to somebody, a therapist, a mental health. Some people have religious beliefs, some people have clergies. But how to resolve this psychosocial crisis is by identifying that there is actually a problem, first and foremost, and secondly, being willing to speak about it. The second question, which was, what may be expected if a psychosocial crisis is unresolved during this stage? What is expected is seeing somebody on spiral. So some people who are successful, they may have like an outline or a map of where they see themselves in life, and where they have a plan step by step, or some people may not have a plan step by step. But if a person is unsuccessful in a stage, then I believe that they will feel like they don't have a sense of purpose per se, or they feel that they may be lost. And the last research question is, what are the impacts of the chronal system on the stage of trust and mistrust. And I believe that the chronal system, the impact of the chronal system is, I want to say, what would the societal view have on that child, in the sense of their environment, in the sense of the meso, the macro, the chrono, the exo. When looking at those systems, we look at the impact of that through the whole ecological lens of how this can impact the first stage. A child's immediate environment in micro is their parents, grandparents, caretakers. So what does that look like from a single family home? Or what does that look like from being raised from a grandparent? And then from a macro, the schools, their community. What does that look like if there's no parent involvement? So from the trust and mistrust, I believe that the chronal system stage starts from understanding where we can be successful as educators, and educating society on these stages that may have an impact will have an impact on children's coming up, and also identifying the impact that it may have in us who haven't successfully achieved any of our stages. Thank you.